The relentless snow fell in New York, blanketing the grand Fifth Avenue mansions as if the heavens themselves sought to muffle the whispers, the pretense, and the hidden wounds veiled behind lace curtains. Gas lamps flickered, casting tremulous light onto the icy sidewalks, where the distant clatter of carriages echoed like a hushed breath in the blizzard. Amidst the ornate iron gates and marble facades, a solitary figure struggled onward. Shrouded in a threadbare coat, her face raw from the biting wind, Lydia Westbrook clutched a small, worn valise to her chest. Her boots were soaked, her hands numb, and each step she took through the deepening snow grew slower, more agonizing, more profoundly humiliating. Hours earlier, she had been cast out of the Fairchild household like a common thief. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, a woman whose tongue was as sharp as her fortune was dangerous, had accused Lydia of shattering a porcelain vase imported from Paris, an accident Lydia had not caused, but one for which no explanation was tolerated. In the scrutinizing gaze of the other servants, she was dismissed without a reference, without a kind word, the door slamming shut behind her like a final decree. She had no family in the city. Her father, a once respected clockmaker, had passed 2 winters ago. Her mother, a seamstress with hands worn smooth by countless stitches, had died long before that. Lydia had survived on her work, her reputation as a discreet, punctual, clean and quiet young woman. But in Manhattan's high society, a woman without lineage, without backing and without fortune was more fragile than crystal. A single accusation was enough to cast her into the merciless winter. The wind cut like knives, stripping sensation from her fingers wrapped around the valise handle. She had lost all track of how long she had walked. She recognized some of the stately facades, the gilded reliefs above doorways, the lanterns carved with the initials of magnates and their wives. Fifth Avenue was a parade of opulence and silent judgment. Not a single door among them would open for someone like her. Her legs gave way directly in front of one such residence. It was taller than the rest, with stark grey walls, classical columns, and balconies adorned with wrought iron. There was no visible name, yet something in its heavily curtained windows spoke of mourning, of absence, of secrets held tight. Lydia felt the world spin. The valise tumbled from her grasp, and she sank to her knees in the snow, strength utterly drained, voice lost. Only a silent, desperate prayer formed on her lips. Then, the sharp sound of hooves breaking the ice jolted her. A black carriage drawn by 2 dark-coated horses pulled to a halt before her. From its door descended a tall man, draped in a wool coat with a velvet collar, a top hat and leather gloves. His presence commanded respect, yet without arrogance. He possessed the bearing of an English lord, though his serious, deep grey eyes spoke of sleepless nights and inconsolable losses. The coachman moved to usher the fallen girl away, but the man raised a hand, approaching slowly, observing Lydia without a word. She lifted her gaze with immense effort, frost clinging to her lashes, her breath escaping in brief, trembling clouds. Still, her hazel eyes, warm even in the cold, did not plead. They only resisted. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. Lydia nodded, though her body refused to obey. A wave of dizziness swept over her. The man steadied her with a firm but gentle hand, then lifted her valise with one hand and helped her into the carriage with the other. No one spoke. The coachman closed the door, and the horses resumed their stately pace, leaving the snow-covered street behind. Inside, the silence was thick. Lydia struggled to regain her breath, the interior's warmth a sharp contrast to her wounded pride. The stranger watched her from the corner of his eye, without intrusion, as if weighing the immense burden of her sorrow. He did not ask her name, offered no demands for explanation, and she, her voice trapped in her chest, offered none. The journey was brief. They stopped once more before the very mansion where Lydia had collapsed. Once inside, the young woman was entrusted to the butler, a severe-faced man named Mr. Avery, who frowned at her appearance but did not question his master's command. "See that she is settled in the east wing room," the stranger instructed. "She is soaked. Provide her with dry clothing and something warm." Then he disappeared up a side staircase without a backward glance. Lydia was led through carpeted hallways, beneath crystal chandeliers, past ancient portraits. The warmth of the house couldn't quell the tremor deep within her. Her mind still struggled to comprehend what had transpired. Only when she found herself alone in a simple yet warm room, wrapped in a thick blanket with a cup of tea in her hands, could she finally close her eyes. That night, in a mansion where laughter had been absent for years, a nameless, coatless woman crossed the threshold from oblivion into a destiny she could not yet imagine. And though she didn't know it, the reigning silence within those walls had just begun to crack. The first sliver of light to filter through the velvet curtains was faint, almost hesitant, as if even the sun was wary of entering that silent house. The room where Lydia awoke lacked the ostentatious luxury of the grand Fifth Avenue chambers, yet it held an elegant sobriety that spoke of another era. The walls, papered in pale blue with faded delicate flowers, exuded an antique air. Beside the wrought-iron bed, a small table held a kerosene lamp, its flame barely flickering, almost spent. Lydia opened her eyes slowly, as if emerging from a dream she couldn't recall. Her limbs felt heavy, her body warm and clothed in dry garments that weren't her own. A soft linen shift had replaced the soaked blouse from the previous night. For a moment, the silence felt unreal, as if everything that had happened in the storm had been a hallucination. But as she looked around and noted the frost-covered window, she knew she wasn't in her boarding room, nor in the Fairchild's house. She was nowhere she could call her own. She rose with effort, her bare feet touching the plush carpet with a certain reverence. Before she could even search for her boots or valise, a soft knock came at the door. "May I?" a dry, precise male voice inquired. Before she could answer, the door opened cautiously, and Mr. Avery, the angular-faced butler with a voice like winter, stepped into the room. He wore a black frock coat, a pearl-grey waistcoat, and white gloves that did little to soften the rigidity of his hands. "Mr. Penbrock wishes to inform you that if you accept, you may remain in the house," he stated bluntly. "You are offered a temporary position as companion to Miss Clara, his niece." Lydia didn't respond immediately. Her mind still tried to piece together the puzzle. Why had she been brought here? Why had this man, so restrained, so unexpressive, chosen to offer her refuge in the midst of the snow? Who was the child who now needed companionship? She dared to ask, "Does Mr. Penbrock usually receive employees in this manner?" "Mr. Penbrock's decisions require no explanation," the butler interrupted with forced politeness. "If you accept, someone will bring appropriate attire, and you will be shown your place." His tone was courteous, but devoid of warmth. Every word was measured with surgical precision, as if nothing in that house could afford emotional disarray. Lydia nodded, without much conviction. In truth, she had nowhere to go. Her pride, though wounded, urged her not to stay. However, reason, that serene voice clinging to common sense, reminded her that in the New York winter, independence could mean death. After Mr. Avery withdrew, a young maid with large eyes and dark braids appeared with a grey dress and a clean apron. Her name was Nora, and unlike the butler, she offered a timid, almost childlike smile. She helped Lydia dress in silence, clumsily combed her hair, and fastened a small, opaque pearl brooch above the lace collar. "You have delicate hands," Nora commented softly, without looking at her. "They don't seem like a maid's." Lydia lowered her gaze, offering no reply. She had learned that in houses like this, words could be more dangerous than silences. They walked through wide corridors, illuminated by gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath their steps, but no one spoke. As they advanced, Lydia noticed the dense quietude, as if every corner guarded an ancient secret, sealed beneath layers of invisible dust. Finally, they arrived at a bright gallery overlooking the rear garden. There, seated on a sofa beneath a Scottish wool blanket, was Clara, Mr. Penbrock's niece. She was 11 years old, but her pale blue eyes revealed a melancholic maturity beyond her years. She held an open book, though she was clearly not reading it. Her blonde hair, almost white, fell over her shoulders like flaxen strands. "She doesn't speak much," Nora whispered in Lydia's ear. "Not since her mother, you know." The young woman nodded silently. She approached slowly, careful not to invade the child's space. She sat at a distance, ensuring her presence wasn't imposing. Clara watched her from the corner of her eye, showing no emotion. Then Lydia took a book from a nearby shelf, opened it at random, and began to read aloud softly, as if reciting to herself. Her voice was unhurried, with a gentle tone that filled the air effortlessly. Several minutes passed in this way, without a word, without a gesture. Only Lydia's voice, the garden breeze, and the distant chime of a pendulum clock marking the hours. When the chapter ended, Clara shifted on the sofa and, for the first time, smiled. It was a faint smile, barely perceptible, but enough for Lydia to understand that she had just breached an invisible wall. At lunchtime, Lydia was guided to the kitchen, where the staff ate at a long oak table. The atmosphere was more relaxed there, but loud conversations were still avoided. Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, watched her with hard eyes. Her face was broad, weathered by years, and perpetually suspicious. "You look very clean for someone who slept in the snow," she said, without raising her voice. "Here, cleanliness is earned through work, not pretty gestures." Mr. Avery interrupted her with a glance, but the message had already been delivered. Later, as she returned to her room, Nora dared to speak to her in an even softer voice. "Many here still mourn Mrs. Penbrock," she said. "She died 3 years ago, but the house is still in mourning. No one has changed anything since then. And the master, well, he doesn't speak to anyone anymore, only gives short, clear orders, sometimes not even that." "What happened to her?" Lydia asked delicately. "They say she took her own life, though no one says it aloud. She was young, beautiful, and silent as a portrait." Lydia felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the increasingly thick atmosphere forming in her chest. Something in that house seemed frozen in time, as if the grief had not been overcome, but embalmed. That night, returning to the gallery, Clara awaited her with an extra blanket and a second book. She didn't speak, but invited Lydia to sit closer. Lydia obeyed. As she read aloud, she felt someone's eyes observing her from the doorway. She looked up and saw him, Nathaniel Penbrock, leaning against the doorframe, impeccably dressed in a black redingote, his hair perfectly combed, his gaze fixed upon her. He said nothing, did not approach, simply observed her with an intensity that simultaneously chilled and burned. Lydia quickly lowered her gaze. Her voice faltered for an instant, but then continued reading. Clara noticed nothing, or perhaps she did, but chose not to mention it. When Lydia looked up again, Nathaniel was gone, and for the first time since entering the mansion, Lydia felt that the man's silence was not absence, but a warning. The Penbrock mansion held many closed doors, some of carved wood with antique fittings, others of frosted glass, hinting at forgotten rooms behind them. But there were also invisible doors, those no servant dared to cross, untouched even by the wind. Lydia soon learned to distinguish them. It was enough to observe how the servants quickened their pace or lowered their gaze when passing certain corridors. The east wing, for example, remained shrouded in a distinct quietude, denser, as if the air there hadn't been breathed in years. One morning, while accompanying Clara on her strolls through the indoor conservatory, Nora confided that the West Wing had been sealed on the day of Eleanor Penbrock's burial, the master's wife. No one spoke of the subject again, neither the funeral, nor the mourning, nor the manner of her departure. It was said that the entire mansion had changed since then. That memory stirred in Lydia a mix of fear and curiosity. There was something in the house's walls, something silent yet pulsating, as if every brick remembered a lost whisper. And so it was that one afternoon, while Clara slept soundly on the reading room sofa, Lydia dared to walk down a seldom-used corridor at the far east end of the house. The hallway was dimly lit by gas lamps whose flames barely flickered. The silence there was unnatural, thick, almost solemn. At the end of the corridor, a double door, taller than the others, drew attention not for its minimal ornamentation, but for the veil of dust and oblivion that covered it. The bronze doorknob was cold, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Lydia placed her hand upon it carefully, fearing that the mere contact might break something sacred. The door yielded without resistance. The interior was in gloom. The closed velvet curtains barely filtered the afternoon light. Upon entering, the air smelled of old wood, faded perfume, and something more, a faint trace of dried flowers, as if someone had left a bouquet on the mantelpiece many years ago. The parlour was spacious, with high ceilings and delicate mouldings. Family portraits, English landscapes, and faded tapestries adorned the walls, but nothing captured the eye as much as the large canvas above the central fireplace. There, illuminated by a shaft of light that pierced through the curtains, she appeared, Nathaniel Penbrock. Lydia felt her heart leap. The woman in the portrait wore an antique white silk gown with long sleeves, a fitted bodice, and hand-embroidered lace. Her dark brown hair was swept up in a low chignon, and a small diamond cameo rested at her neck. Her skin was alabaster, and her steel-grey eyes seemed to gaze across time. She was beautiful, but not with an arrogant beauty. There was in her expression a serenity that bordered on sadness. She did not smile, but neither did she seem to suffer. It was as if her image had been captured in an instant of contemplation, an intimate moment that did not belong to the world. Lydia didn't know how long she remained there, motionless. Only when she heard footsteps in the corridor did she recoil with a start, carefully closing the door and returning to the reading room, where Clara still slept, embracing her blanket. That evening, as the hall clock struck 9, Lydia headed to the gallery to return the books to their place. Then she saw him. Nathaniel Penbrock stood by one of the columns, a glass of brandy in hand. His figure was tall, imposing, dressed in black from head to toe. His frock coat hung elegantly, and his boots gleamed under the golden light of the chandelier. His face, though shadowed by weariness, retained an austere and noble beauty. He was a man whose presence commanded attention without need for words. Lydia stopped short. He looked at her without surprise or judgment, only with that same reserved expression with which one observes an ancient painting. "Clara is asleep," she said in a low voice. Nathaniel nodded slightly, without averting his gaze. "I know." His voice was deep, with a subtle accent, difficult to place, as if he had been educated in many places and none at the same time. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but it was charged with a subtle tension. Lydia felt something within her contract, as if her body knew before her mind that she was facing a man who could stir her without touching her. Nathaniel shifted his gaze towards the garden. "She didn't speak much," he murmured then. "My wife." The comment took her by surprise. She hadn't expected him to mention the lady in the portrait, nor to break the silence with something so personal, but she didn't respond. She felt that any word would break the spell of the moment. "Sometimes," he continued, "I wonder if I was ever truly capable of understanding her." Lydia felt a shiver. That confession, uttered in a contained voice, carried the weight of an ancient guilt, something unsaid, something that pained him. But he added nothing more. He took a sip from his glass, then departed in silence, his measured footsteps echoing on the marble until they faded away. The next day, Clara awaited her impatiently. She no longer simply listened. Now she brought her books, chose the stories, pointed out the pages. Lydia understood that the child not only accepted her, but needed her. Her presence was a balm in that house filled with sealed rooms. During the reading, Lydia once again felt that gaze. She looked up and saw him in the doorway, Nathaniel Penbrock standing motionless, silently observing the child smile as she listened to a story about enchanted forests and bluebirds. He didn't enter, didn't speak, just watched. But this time, there was something different in his expression. It wasn't coldness or curiosity, it was nostalgia, as if for an instant he had remembered something he thought lost. Lydia lowered her gaze and continued reading, though her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. Clara, oblivious, rested her head on Lydia's lap, and the man in the doorway, after a few minutes, left without a sound. That night before sleeping, Lydia thought again of the lady in the portrait, of her stormy eyes, of the imposed serenity of her face, and of the question she now asked herself, unable to avoid it. What lay hidden behind the silence of that woman, and the silence of the man who still mourned her without uttering her name? The snow, which in the early days had fallen like a soft blanket over Fifth Avenue's rooftops, now began to melt slowly, revealing the dirty grey of the sidewalks and the wet crunch beneath the carriage's wheels. Yet inside the Penbrock mansion, winter held fast. It lingered in the silent corridors, in the dust-covered portraits, in the dim light that barely filtered through the thick curtains. And yet, something had shifted. The servants noticed it, though no one dared to speak it aloud. Mr. Penbrock spent more time at home. He no longer left early, coat buttoned high to his neck, gaze fixed on the ground. He remained in the library for hours, strolled through the gardens, paused before the conservatory, and most perplexing of all, he sometimes stopped in the gallery to observe Lydia and Clara, unannounced, without issuing commands, without interrupting. He simply watched. One afternoon, while Lydia read a tale of enchanted swans and lost princesses, Clara let out a clear laugh, like a silver bell that hadn't been heard in that house for years. It was then that the unthinkable happened. Nathaniel, standing by the window, smiled. It wasn't a broad, effusive smile. It was faint, barely a movement at the corner of his lips, but it was enough. Nora saw it from the hallway and commented on it that very night while polishing the silverware with other maids. "I swear I saw it," she said. "A real smile." "For a maid?" another murmured, with a tone of disguised scandal. "She's not just a maid," Nora corrected, almost without thinking. But the phrase had already taken root, and tongues, always thirsty for novelty, began to wag. In the kitchens, in the hallways, in the servants' quarters, murmurs turned into versions and versions into suspicions. That the new companion was drawing too much attention, that the master allowed her too much, that the butler, so strict with everyone, treated her with unusual deference, and the most daring of all, that Nathaniel Penbrock, the silent widower, had taken notice of her. The news was quick to leave the mansion. A seamstress delivering weekly orders carried it to the modistes district. There, amidst silks and patterns, a client named Graves, an intimate friend of Eleanor Fairchild, overheard the comment and promptly repeated it during an afternoon tea. That same afternoon, Eleanor Fairchild, wrapped in a white fox fur coat and a hat laden with black plumes, entered Mrs. Carmody's tea salon, one of the city's most refined gossip hubs. And there, a glass of sherry in hand, her voice perfectly modulated, she began her crusade. "Imagine my surprise," she declared, "when I learned that the maid I dismissed for breaking a French relic was welcomed without references into the Penbrock home. Isn't that curious? Doesn't it seem improper?" The ladies present exchanged significant glances. In that world of appearances and feigned morality, a mere suggestion was enough. No proof was needed, only well-placed innuendos. And what will families say when they discover a woman without a name has captivated the attention of such a coveted widower? Eleanor added, stirring her cup with a measured gesture. Within days, the whispers spread through the drawing rooms of high society like wildfire on dry cloth. It was rumoured that Mr. Penbrock had lost his mind, that his grief had clouded his judgment, that his wife, so discreet and elegant, must be turning in her grave. Some even claimed that Lydia was a failed actress, disguised as a servant. Lydia, of course, knew nothing immediately, but the atmosphere in the house grew thick, laden with veiled glances and sharp silences. One afternoon, upon returning to her room, she found an unsigned letter on her pillow. The envelope, unsealed and nameless, contained a single sheet with precise, firmly inked handwriting. The message was short. A decent woman knows when to withdraw. Do not tarnish the name that does not yet belong to you. Lydia felt a cold, different from Winter's. There was no signature or direct threat, but the weight of humiliation was palpable. Her heart, which had begun to open timidly, recoiled once more. That night, while Clara slept, Lydia silently packed her valise. She didn't cry. She simply folded each garment with care, as if that act could restore her control. She didn't know where she would go. She only knew she couldn't stay. But before closing the valise, she heard a soft tap at the door. It was Mr. Avery. The butler entered without waiting for permission, his face as inscrutable as ever. He carried a tray with tea and a bun, but he did not set it down. He remained standing, observing her. "Do you intend to leave without a word?" he asked in a neutral tone. Lydia, uncomfortable, barely nodded. "It is not appropriate for me to remain here if it harms Mr. Penbrock's name." The butler looked at her for a long moment. "Mr. Penbrock's name has weathered wars, losses, and betrayals," he said. "It will not break because of the kindness of a woman who reads stories to a sick child." She tried to respond, but her lips trembled. Mr. Avery approached with his usual rigidity and placed the tray on the dresser. "If someone has sullied anything," he added softly, "it has not been you. And if you choose to leave, it will not be by order of this house." He withdrew without another word. Minutes later, Clara appeared in her nightgown, bare feet and loose hair. She hugged a book to her chest. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice weak but resolute. Lydia didn't know what to say. "Don't leave me," the child whispered. "Please." The little girl sat on the floor and began to cry, covering her face with her hands. Lydia rushed to embrace her, kneeling by her side. She felt her heart break in a new, different way, not from shame, but from love. Embraced in the middle of that room that still smelled of lavender, she knew she couldn't leave. Even if the world pointed fingers, this house was now a refuge, a testament, a place where someone smiled again because of her. The next day, as she descended with Clara for breakfast, Miss Hawthorne received her with a less harsh gaze. She didn't smile, but neither did she frown. Lydia understood that something, however imperceptible, had changed. And while the city continued to murmur names among porcelain cups and perfume fans, in the Penbrock mansion, loyalty began to blossom from silence. And sometimes silence was more eloquent than 1,000 voices. The Penbrock mansion, always solemn, awoke that morning with a different stir. Footsteps were quicker, the corridors filled with warm aromas of beeswax, cinnamon, and fresh flowers. From early on, the servants moved quietly, yet with a certain contained anticipation. Clara was turning 12, and for the first time since the death of Mrs. Eleanor, Mr. Nathaniel had ordered a private evening prepared to celebrate. There would be no external guests, only a few close family members, staff, Clara's doctor, and a violinist hired exclusively to play soft melodies in the stained-glass parlor. Still, the decision surprised everyone. For years, this anniversary had passed in complete silence. A candle would be lit, a light dinner served, and the day concluded with no more words than necessary. This time, the entire house breathed as if awakening from a long, sad dream. Lydia didn't know what to think upon receiving the invitation, written on a sheet of ivory paper, calligraphed in black ink, and delivered by Mr. Avery himself. "Miss Clara insists you must attend," the butler said in his usual imperturbable tone. "Mr. Penbrock has not objected." And the child's handwriting, adorned with clumsily drawn flowers in the margins, included a phrase that made Lydia's heart beat fiercely. "I want you to be there, as part of my happy day." The dress Nora delivered later had been discreetly altered by the house's seamstresses. It was a simple model of mauve muslin, without luxurious lace or pretentious embroidery. The neckline was high, the sleeves long and fitted, and the ribbon at the waist merely hinted at her silhouette. But there was a pure delicacy in the garment, a soft, artless femininity. When Lydia looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Not because of the dress itself, but because of the way she wore it. There was a new light in her eyes, a mix of shyness and resolve, as if for the first time she allowed herself to exist outside the shadows. The soirée began shortly after 6, as the sun began to set behind the parlour's tall windows. The gas lamps glowed with a warm flame, and the hanging chandeliers multiplied golden reflections on the marble floor. Stained glass filtered the light in amber and violet tones, dusting faces with silent gleams. Clara appeared dressed in light blue with a small satin bow in her hair and eyes bright with excitement. Seeing Lydia enter, she let out an exclamation that made everyone present turn. "You're beautiful." The girl ran to her and naturally took her hand. In that gesture, as pure as it was unexpected, the silence of the room deepened further. Lydia felt the stares. Some were sincere, others inquisitive, and a few, the sharpest ones, disguised as courtesy. But she would not be intimidated. She walked with Clara to the center of the parlor, where the violinist tuned his instrument. It was then that Nathaniel appeared. He wore an immaculate black frock coat, with a white linen shirt and a light grey silk handkerchief in his pocket. He wore no jewellery, save for the chain watch nestled inside his waistcoat. His posture was erect, and his expression, though serene, did not entirely conceal a contained tension. His eyes sought Clara first, then settled on Lydia. He observed her unhurriedly, dwelling on every detail. The colour of the dress, the simplicity of her coiffure, the way she lowered her gaze just barely upon noticing him. He walked towards them. Each step resonated like a deep note in the expectant silence. When he stopped before Lydia, he slowly extended his arm. "Will you grant me this dance?" Lydia looked at him, surprised. She didn't know if she should accept. Her breath hitched, but Clara gently nudged her, and Nathaniel's lips curved into a barely perceptible half-smile. She placed her hand in his, and it was like touching a surface that burned from within, yet did not scorch. His fingers were firm, sure. He led her to the center of the room, where the violinist, without a word, began to play. The melody was slow, nostalgic, with long chords and sustained notes, as if time itself had lengthened in that hall for everything to unfold at a different pace. Lydia danced with a contained awkwardness, not from lack of skill, but from an acute awareness of every inch of proximity between them. Nathaniel said nothing. He maintained the proper distance, the right pressure, the measured step, but his eyes held her as if no one else existed in that room, as if everything else had vanished. No one murmured, no one dared. Only the music was heard, the soft brush of footsteps on the marble, and the invisible whisper of two hearts that, for an instant, seemed to beat in unison. When the piece concluded, Nathaniel released Lydia's hand with a slight bow. She inclined her head in response, and both separated without words. For the remainder of the evening, he did not approach her again. He conversed briefly with the doctor, greeted some employees, and retired before the others. But in his gaze, before disappearing behind the library's double doors, there was a trace of something unique, irreplicable. Later, already in her room, Lydia couldn't sleep. The dress hung on the hanger like a still warm memory. She sat by the window, wrapped in her wool dressing gown, her heart still beating beneath her skin. Past 11, someone knocked at the door. It was Mr. Avery. "Mr. Penbrock wishes to see you in the library," he simply said. Lydia descended the stairs slowly. Each step creaked as if the house itself held its breath. When she entered, Nathaniel stood by the lit fireplace. He held a closed book in his hands, staring at the flames without truly seeing them. "Thank you for staying tonight," he said without looking directly at her. Clara was happy. Lydia nodded. She didn't know if she should respond. He turned to her, and this time his gaze was clearer, more human. "I haven't danced since I lost her," he confessed. "I thought I never would again." She took a step forward. "I have never loved," she whispered with a sincerity that surprised even herself. A thick silence settled between them. They did not touch, yet they were close, so close that Lydia could perceive the faint scent of wood and brandy on his breath, so close that the crackling of the fireplace seemed to roar between their hearts. Nathaniel raised a hand, but did not extend it. He merely held it suspended in the air, as if fearing any gesture might break what floated there. And then, without touching her, without saying anything more, he took a step back. "Good night, Miss Westbrook." Lydia inclined her head, crossed the door in silence, and did not look back. But as it closed, her lips curved into a faint smile. Not for what had happened, but for what had not, for what had been held back, for what remained trembling in the air between them. In that mansion of cold walls, a silent dance had just ignited an invisible fire. Winter continued its course in New York City, but in the Penbrock mansion, the air carried a different weight, a different rhythm. Shadows lengthened more slowly in the corridors. Clocks seemed to pause between chimes, as if time itself had surrendered to the beat of a memory. One January afternoon, as the wind lashed at the tall windows of the study, Lydia found herself in the main library, organizing ancient books that Clara had scattered in her eagerness to find one on constellations. The child, fascinated by the winter sky, insisted on learning the names of the stars, and Nathaniel, though silent, seemed pleased by this new curiosity that Lydia herself had awakened. The tall, dark wood shelves held leather-bound editions, forgotten atlases, and correspondence sealed with faded ribbons. As she tidied a thick volume on astronomy, Lydia noticed that one of Mr. Penbrock's desk drawers was slightly ajar. It was not customary for anything to be out of order in that house, least of all in a room that exuded formality. She hesitated to close it, but a slight rustle of paper stopped her. There, among legal documents and unimportant sheets, a letter stood out as if begging to be read. The feminine handwriting, rounded and elegant, was unmistakable. The envelope was unsealed, undated, with only a name on the front written in sepia ink: Nathaniel. Lydia was not a woman to violate secrets. Her mother's rigorous upbringing had instilled in her the value of silence, respect for what belonged to others, prudence as a shield. But something in that letter unsettled her, not out of curiosity, but an inexplicable anguish, as if its content held not just words, but something that affected all who inhabited that house. Her trembling fingers extracted the page. "Forgive me if this arrives late. I didn't know how to tell you while I was alive. I lacked the courage, and now I fear that what I kept silent will end up destroying the little that remains between us." Lydia's heart tightened. She read no further. She didn't need to. Those first lines were enough to understand that this letter was no ordinary message, but a confession, one that Eleanor Penbrock had never managed to deliver in life. Lydia carefully refolded it, placed it back where she had found it, and slowly closed the drawer. She stepped away from the desk as if she had touched a tomb. For hours, her conscience oscillated between guilt and duty. Did she have the right to keep silent? What if that letter concealed something that needed to be known? What if breaking that silence unleashed a chain of consequences that none could stop? As night fell, her heart a knot of apprehension, Lydia decided to remain silent for now. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps because she felt that this past did not belong to her, even if it burned so close to her chest. The next morning, a dark green carriage stopped in front of the main entrance. From it descended a medium-height man, cloaked in a thick wool cape, polished boots, and a low top hat. His face, thin and precisely shaven, retained an artificial youthfulness, like one who fears aging in the mirror. Frederick Fairchild, Eleanor's brother-in-law, and the scandal-mongering lady's relative, came on no one's behalf, but with clear intentions. He was received in the blue parlour by Mr. Avery, who, after consulting with Mr. Penbrock, led him to the study. Lydia didn't see him enter, but heard the tone of his voice from the hallway. It was a soft, oily timbre, calculatingly amiable, a man who measured his words with the precision of one who knows flattery can be sharper than reproach. Frederick wasted no time in revealing his purpose. With a glass of sherry in hand, he began by speaking of old friendships, of the sadness over Eleanor's passing, of how much he respected the Penbrock family's memory. Then, with the subtlety of a serpent, he insinuated his true concern. "I understand you have allowed a young woman without lineage to remain in your house longer than necessary," he said, feigning regret. "Gossip doesn't cease, Nathaniel, and when gossip multiplies, it can drag even the most prudent into disrepute." Nathaniel did not interrupt. He merely observed him. His glass remained untouched, his expression impassive. "I have come to offer you assistance," Frederick continued with a forced smile. "There are ways to silence rumors, to restore order without scandal. This woman, this Westbrook, what do we know of her? Perhaps she has come here with other motives. Motives you do not suspect. What decent young woman settles under a widower's roof with no company other than her own beauty?" The ensuing silence was colder than the snow. Nathaniel rose to his feet. "Your presence is not welcome," he said in a firm voice. Frederick feigned bewilderment. "I am only trying to protect what remains of the good name of—" "Do not mention my surname with your tongue," Nathaniel interrupted, stepping forward. "Not another word." Frederick, though surprised, bowed theatrically, took his hat, and left the study without looking back. Lydia saw him cross the vestibule. She felt his gaze fix on her, laden with judgment and superiority. The man stopped a few feet away, lowered his voice slightly and whispered, "Be careful, miss. Stairs are high and falls are painful." And he departed. Later, when Lydia was in the conservatory, Nathaniel appeared. He walked among the plants with his hands clasped behind his back, not looking at her. The tension in his jaw was visible. His frock coat was unbuttoned, and his hair more dishevelled than usual. "Do you know who that man was?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir," she replied serenely. "I knew as soon as I saw him." "He's a coward dressed as a gentleman," he murmured, "and a coward always seeks a weaker victim to display his strength." Lydia didn't respond. She only observed him. His eyes held a different gleam, as if a battle deeper than the one she had just witnessed was raging within him. "Should I be concerned about your presence here, Miss Westbrook?" he suddenly asked, turning to her. The question stung her, but it did not surprise her. She looked at him with firmness, without lowering her gaze. "That only you can decide, sir." There was a moment of pause. The conservatory, with its scent of damp earth and green leaves, seemed to listen. Nathaniel closed his eyes for an instant, then turned around. "I have nothing to decide," he said, and left. Lydia remained there alone among the plants, her heart beating in the center of her chest as if it couldn't find its place. And that night, as she tidied the books in her room, she once again took Eleanor Penbrock's letter into her hands. Her fingers caressed the sealed envelope. She still hadn't delivered it, and now, more than ever, she knew her silence was a burden that grew with every passing hour, because the past was returning, and not everyone was prepared to face it. The clock bells in the vestibule resonated with a painful slowness, marking a thick night, as if time itself hesitated to proceed. In the East Wing guest room, Lydia stood by the window, her fingers gripping the wooden frame, her lips trembling with the words still alive within her. Eleanor Penbrock's letter rested on the dresser, folded with extreme care, as if its content could wound with a mere touch. She had spent entire days debating in silence. She had tried to forget the lines she'd read, to erase the guilt that clung to her skin like the cold dew of dawn. But the truth weighed heavily, as conscience does when a boundary has been crossed. She hadn't stolen or lied, but she had read what she shouldn't have. And although she had done so out of fear, out of compassion, or an inexplicable force, the fact persisted, burning with every heartbeat. That night, while the mansion slept and the snow began to fall again, Lydia made the decision she had postponed for too long. At 10 o'clock, she walked through the corridors with firm steps. Her grey wool dress barely rustled with the brush of wind that slipped through the cracks. She knocked on the study door. There was no immediate response, but a deep, slow voice answered from within. "Come in!" Nathaniel Penbrock stood before the blazing fire, his face illuminated by the flames dancing rhythmically in the fireplace. He wore a white shirt without a waistcoat, his cuffs unbuttoned, and an expression that was tense, almost absent. When he saw her enter, he barely arched an eyebrow. Lydia advanced, the letter in her hands. "I need to tell you something, sir," she murmured without raising her gaze. He did not move, only waited. "A few days ago, while organizing some papers in the library, I found a letter. It was in one of your drawers, unsealed. I recognized your wife's handwriting." Nathaniel frowned. His body tensed. "I read it," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I shouldn't have, I know, but I did, and I couldn't keep silent any longer." The silence that followed was like that of a contained storm. Nathaniel approached slowly, his steps firm on the rug. "You read my wife's words?" he asked, without raising his voice, but with an edge of ice in his tone. Lydia nodded, swallowing with difficulty. "I had no intention of causing harm. It was an impulse and a weakness." He extended his hand. She handed him the letter. "Have you told anyone else about this?" "No one." Nathaniel read the first lines. His jaw tightened. When he looked up, his eyes were no longer those of the man who had offered her his arm in a dance, nor those who watched her from the gallery threshold. They were the eyes of a man wounded in his pride. "You have violated something sacred," he said, and each word fell like a stone. "This letter was for me, and only for me. It did not belong to you." Lydia bowed her head. "I know, and that is why I will leave." He did not respond. He simply turned back to the fire, as if the heat could burn away the betrayal without uttering it. Lydia took a step back, then another. She withdrew without him dismissing her, without a word that could redeem her. She closed the door softly, but the echo of his reproach pursued her like a long shadow. Hours later, her valise was packed. Nora, her eyes red-rimmed, begged her not to leave, but Lydia couldn't stay. Not after what she had done, not after breaking the trust of a man who lived among silences because pain prevented him from speaking. Before leaving, she wanted to say goodbye to Clara. The girl slept, hugging one of the books Lydia used to read to her. Lydia kissed her forehead tenderly and closed the bedroom door, suppressing a sob. The hallway was dim. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if it knew something was about to break. As she passed through the central gallery, Lydia paused before the double doors of the portrait room. It was the only place she hadn't dared to look at one last time. She pushed gently. The room was silent, bathed in the pale moonlight that filtered through the tall windows. Eleanor's portrait hung above the fireplace, just as it had the first time she had seen it. The woman in the white dress watched her with that serene expression that no longer seemed so innocent. Lydia approached slowly. An intuition compelled her to look more closely. The gilded, filigreed frame had a small plaque at the bottom. Until then, she had believed it contained only the deceased's name, but as she leaned in, as her fingers grazed the lower edge, she discovered something that chilled her blood. The inscription read, "Eleanor Fairchild Penbrock, née Eleanor Fairchild." The same family, the same surname. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, who had worked so hard to tarnish her name, was a direct relative of Nathaniel's deceased wife. The weight of that revelation fell upon her like an iron bell. The letter, the death, the rumors, everything took on a new meaning. She staggered back, dizzy, Her breath caught. Why had no one mentioned it before? Why had Eleanor Fairchild hidden this connection? Why had Nathaniel never brought it up? A pang of suspicion pierced her chest. What if Eleanor's death hadn't been an accident? What if that letter, written in trembling ink, was more than a confession? And what if Eleanor Fairchild had reasons to keep silent, and also to silence her? Lydia stumbled out of the room. The cold of the hallway enveloped her in a harsh embrace. The mansion, so imposing, so impenetrable, now seemed a theatre of secrets wrapped in velvet. Upon reaching her room, she hid the letter at the bottom of her valise, like someone concealing a stick of dynamite. She was about to leave, but it was no longer just out of shame or dignity. Now, a dangerous truth pulsed within the walls of that house, and perhaps someone else did not want it to come to light. Dawn arrived without light. Dense clouds hung over the city like an omen. A grey mist enveloped Fifth Avenue, and the Penbrock mansion stood silhouetted in the fog like a silent castle. Lydia had remained awake all night, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the closed valise, her heart torn between duty and uncertainty. The letter was still there, hidden among neatly folded clothes, yet it weighed more than all her luggage. Together with the inscription discovered on the portrait, they formed a dangerous puzzle. The pieces were incomplete, but the outline was clear. Eleanor Fairchild, a lady of immaculate appearances, was entangled in a web of secrets that could not remain hidden for much longer. When the clock struck 9, Lydia rose with determination. She could not leave with this knowledge suppressed. It was an act that affected not only Nathaniel but also Clara and the very memory of Eleanor Penbrock. She descended the main staircase, the envelope in her hand. Mr. Avery met her in the vestibule. He asked no questions, his grey eyes fixed on the letter for an instant. Then he turned towards the study. "The master is in the library." The door was ajar. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back straight, his hands clasped behind his waist. He did not turn when Lydia entered. He only spoke without looking at her. "I assumed you would depart at dawn." "I was going to," she said, her voice firm. "But there is something I must deliver before I leave." Nathaniel turned slowly. His face was tired, but not cold. In his eyes was a shadow that was not anger, but a deeper, more personal weariness. Lydia extended the letter. He took it in silence, recognizing it immediately. His fingers barely tensed. "This is not all," she continued without moving. "On your wife's portrait there is an inscription beneath the frame, her maiden name, Fairchild." Nathaniel looked up slowly. "Are you sure?" "I saw it with my own eyes." Nathaniel said nothing more. He walked to the desk, sat down, and read the letter from beginning to end. As he read, his expression transformed, first bewilderment, then distrust, and finally something darker, deeper, pain. When he finished, he placed the letter on the table and rested his elbows on the desk. His hands covered his face for a few seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a murmur. "Eleanor never told me about this." "Perhaps she was afraid," Lydia said softly. Nathaniel raised his gaze to her. This time there was no distance, no barriers. "Why are you giving me this now?" "Because I do not wish to bear the burden of her silence, nor of my own." A long silence settled between them. Then he stood up. "Thank you." There were no more words, but in that brief, contained gesture there was a truce, a door ajar in the midst of a war of emotions. Hours later, Eleanor Fairchild was received in the same parlour where, long ago, she had verbally humiliated Lydia, though without naming her. Her mink coat, her hat adorned with black feathers, her haughty demeanour, everything about her screamed dominance. But upon seeing Nathaniel awaiting her by his wife's portrait, the certainty in her gaze faltered. "What a tragic scene," she said with a thin smile. "Have you decided to decorate the parlour with ghosts?" "I have decided to stop ignoring them," he replied harshly. "And you are one of them." Eleanor took a step forward. "I don't know what you're talking about, Nathaniel." He extracted the letter from his inner pocket and extended it without a single dramatic gesture. Eleanor's final confession. The lady paled, but did not fully show it. She took the sheet without trembling, though her eyes no longer shone as before. She read it quickly, and when she finished, she let out a sigh that was not relief, but defeat. "All this is a dead issue," she said, trying to regain control. "A letter means nothing. She was unstable. Always was." Nathaniel straightened up. "You knew what that letter implied. You knew your cousin feared something you yourself nurtured. I only protected the Fairchild name with blackmail, with threats, with justice." Her voice broke on that last word. "She didn't take anything from you, Eleanor," he said, his voice a mere thread. "But you stole her peace." She took a step back. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor Fairchild didn't know what to say. The silence was more humiliating than any accusation. Nathaniel did not look at her again. The door opened at the butler's command, and the lady crossed the threshold with her head held high, but her eyes cast down. Days later, the rumors spread through the drawing rooms of high society with devastating speed. The most select circles began to whisper loaded phrases. Dignity cannot be bought with pearls. Glass houses should not throw stones. Eleanor Fairchild fell into disgrace, not by public scandal, but by the condemnation of appearances, more feared than justice itself. And in that same whirlwind, Lydia's name emerged like a legend. It was said that a young maid had saved the honor of a broken family, that a woman without lineage had exposed the venom hidden behind the respectable lady's fans. Some saw her with admiration, others with contempt disguised as courtesy, but no one ignored her again. Still, the scandal also touched Nathaniel. Some newspapers insinuated that he had protected a maid for reasons beyond morality. Others questioned his judgment, his stability, even his position on certain financial boards. Lydia knew this, and it consumed her. Although Nathaniel did not blame her, although Mr. Avery and Mrs. Hawthorne offered her respect with their gaze, and Clara hugged her every night, she felt that her presence could cost him what he had worked so hard to rebuild, his name. One afternoon, while Clara slept under a thick blanket and the rain beat against the conservatory glass, Lydia wrote a farewell letter. She tucked it into her room with her belongings. She signed it not with sadness, but with gratitude. She was prepared to leave in silence once more, but before she could, a hand touched her door. And in the doorway, without words, Nathaniel watched her with something more than pain in his eyes. He watched with certainty, with the same resolve with which a man, having walked through the ruins of the past, decides whether to rebuild or remain among the rubble. Winter held fast over Manhattan, though on Fifth Avenue the ice had begun to melt timidly at the edges of the sidewalks. Evening shadows stretched long over the Penbrock mansion, its silhouette rising majestically, imperturbable to the city's growing murmur. Nathaniel stood by his study window, looking without truly seeing. In his fingers, he held a sheet of paper marked with a banking seal. It was a proposal for a commercial alliance, one that could consolidate his businesses at a delicate moment. But, at the bottom of the document, among politely phrased clauses, a condition stood out with the coldness of a dagger. "We strongly advise measures to preserve the image of the Penbrock house, including a review of the personnel currently in service." They mentioned no names, but the message was clear. Mr. Avery, true to his custom, did not interrupt. He remained by the desk with his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the Persian rug, as if from there he could read his master's thoughts. "Have you read it carefully, sir?" he asked, his voice contained. Nathaniel nodded briefly. "I have read it." There was a dense silence, as if both men waited for the other to say what neither wanted to hear. "With all due respect, Mr. Penbrock," the butler finally added, "this family has endured scandals and tragedies without selling its integrity. Your father used to say that appearance is the cloak of cowards, and that the Penbrocks wear dignity." Nathaniel pressed his lips together. His gaze remained fixed on the street, where the snow accumulated at the garden's edges began to melt, as if something within him was doing the same. "Thank you, Avery," he finally murmured. "That is all for now." The butler inclined his head slightly and withdrew, closing the door with an almost reverent care. Only then did Nathaniel let the letter fall onto the table. He rubbed his face with both hands, as if to erase the doubt, the dilemma, the knot that constricted him from chest to stomach. He had spent years rebuilding his family's respect, navigating the cracks left by Eleanor's death, avoiding the whispers and pitying glances of those who believed him a broken widower. Now that everything seemed to be returning to its place, fate confronted him with another crossroads, to choose between the world he knew and the woman who was beginning to bring him back to life. He left the study unannounced, descended the steps with a firm stride, and traversed the long corridor leading to the house's rear wing. His boots echoed on the polished marble, but inside, everything was silence, an expectant silence. The conservatory was illuminated by gas lamps hanging from the wrought iron beams. There, among the plants that defied the cold with their stubborn greenery, Lydia carefully watered a row of blooming pansies. She wore a simple blue wool dress, with a white apron that still carried the scent of the kitchen. Her hair was gathered in a low bun, from which a few strands escaped, glinting under the warm light of the place. Nathaniel paused at the threshold. For a moment he said nothing, simply observed her. There was something about her that reminded him of the first days of spring, fragile and tenacious, discreet and luminous. It wasn't her beauty that disarmed him, but her presence, that way of being without asking permission, of healing without words. "Are you looking for something, sir?" she asked, barely turning her head without surprise, as if she had sensed his arrival beforehand. He advanced a few steps. "You," he replied, his voice softer than he imagined it would be. Lydia set the watering can aside, turned to him, and in her dark eyes there was no fear, but serenity, a serenity learned amidst injustice and resistance. Nathaniel took a deep breath. "Today, I received a partnership proposal from Tien Holbrook Bank, a generous offer, but with conditions disguised as prudence." She said nothing, only watched him, waiting. "They want me to make decisions," he continued, "to act opportunistically, to protect the family's image, to remove inconvenient elements." Lydia tilted her head slightly, understanding. "And will you?" The question dropped like a needle onto glass. Nathaniel lowered his gaze. "I don't know," he confessed, his voice hoarse. "I don't know how to continue being the man expected of me without ceasing to be the man you have awakened." She approached with slow steps. Her dress brushed the tiles with a whisper. When she stood before him, she spoke with a contained tenderness. "I do not wish to belong to your world, Mr. Penbrock. I do not want your parlours, nor your jewels, nor your coat of arms. I desire something simpler and more difficult." He looked up, captivated by the serene strength of her voice. "I desire to share it." The words hung between them like an invisible thread connecting their breaths. Nathaniel slowly raised a hand, as if fearing to break the moment. He barely grazed Lydia's cheek, and she closed her eyes without moving. There was no kiss, only a deep, silent tremor, born in the chest and trembling at the tips of his fingers. And in that instant a childish laugh erupted from behind the magnolia pots. "I knew it!" Clara shouted, her cheerful face peeking out from among the branches. "I knew you were in love!" Lydia pulled away with a choked exclamation. Nathaniel turned on his heels with a guilty smile. "Clara!" he murmured, suppressing a chuckle. The girl ran towards them, her floral flannel dress flying behind her. "You don't have to hide it," she protested. "Neither of you is sad anymore. Why can't you just be happy?" Nathaniel knelt and took her in his arms, holding her close. Clara rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Miss Lydia brought back my laughter. Now it's your turn." Lydia looked at them, her eyes shining. A tear slipped down her cheek, not of sadness, but of that kind of emotion that disarms even the strongest woman. And so, in the middle of the conservatory, surrounded by cold, resistant plants, and a child who had understood what many adults could not, Nathaniel knew he had already chosen. He would not sign the agreement. He would not abandon his heart in the name of prestige. No, this time. Clara extended her hand to Lydia, who took it without hesitation. "So, are we going home?" the girl asked happily. Lydia looked at her with tenderness and replied, "We are already home, Clara." Nathaniel said nothing, but his eyes said it all. Dawn arrived, wrapped in a soft light that caressed the rooftops of Fifth Avenue, still covered by a thin mantle of frost. From the tall windows of the Penbrock mansion, the first rays of the sun filtered through the linen curtains, illuminating the gilded moldings that had remained for years in shadow. But that morning, the house did not awaken in gloom. Something had changed. The air smelled of freshly cut flowers, baked bread, and hope. In the rear garden, the snow had been carefully removed, revealing the stone paths that wound among winter roses, pruned shrubs, and marble sculptures covered with ivy garlands. The servants, dressed in their finest attire, came and went in silence, placing benches, floral arrangements, and white ribbons around the arches that framed the improvised altar in front of the conservatory. From one of the second-floor windows, Clara watched the scene, her eyes alight with anticipation. She wore an ivory coat trimmed with pink velvet, and a small feathered headdress held her golden hair. Beside her, Lydia finished putting on her lace gloves. Her natural pearl-colored silk dress fell in soft waves touching the ground, with hand-embroidered details on the square neckline and long sleeves, inspired by floral motifs. A short veil held by a mother-of-pearl comb delicately framed her face. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked, without taking her eyes off the garden. Lydia took a deep breath. Her heart beat strongly, not from fear, but from an emotion that seemed to envelop her from within like silent music. "I am alive," she replied softly. "And that is enough." The girl smiled, satisfied. She ran down the stairs while Lydia took the bouquet of white lilacs, her favorite flowers since childhood. In the vestibule, Mr. Avery awaited her with a slight bow. He wore a black frock coat and a grey silk cravat. Although his expression remained serene, his eyes held a glimmer of silent pride. "Miss Lydia," he said solemnly, "Mr. Penbrock awaits you." She nodded, controlling the tremor in her hands. She slowly descended the main staircase, the same one she had often passed in silence like a shadow. But today her steps resonated differently. She was no longer the voiceless maid. She was a woman who had chosen to love without fear, even knowing that this love defied unwritten rules. Nathaniel awaited her by the ivy arch, his hair slicked back, and wearing a navy blue three-piece suit, with a light grey brocade waistcoat and a white flower in his lapel. His bearing remained that of a distinguished gentleman, but his eyes were clear of the melancholy that had accompanied him for so long. When he saw her appear, the world seemed to stop. His lips barely curved, but in his gaze there was tenderness, admiration, and a quiet surrender. The ceremony was brief. There were no priests or choristers, only the judge's grave voice and the murmur of the wind among the trees. The witnesses were few: Mr. Avery, the cook, the gardeners, an elderly neighbor who had been a family friend, and Clara standing tall on the terrace with a basket of white petals she threw into the air the instant Nathaniel took Lydia's hand. "I promise to honor your freedom," he said, "and to be loyal to you in calm and in storm." "I promise not to let silence separate us," she responded, "and to remind you every day that we are alive." Oh, there was no applause, only a contained sigh, and then the chime of a crystal bell suspended in the floral arch. It was Clara who had rung it. After the ceremony, the gardens filled with hushed laughter and soft music. A string quartet hidden behind the bushes played waltzes while guests sampled canapes served on silver trays. The cook cried discreetly behind the dessert table, and the gardeners stood with straight backs and moist eyes, as if this too belonged to them. Nathaniel led Lydia into the house. With his own hands, he opened the windows of the main parlour one by one. The cold midday air flowed in, bringing with it the scent of flowers and the promise of a future without hiding places. The entire house seemed transformed. The curtains had been removed, the mirrors polished until they reflected the light. And above the fireplace, where a sombre portrait of Eleanor once rested, now stood a vase of fresh lilies. "She didn't disappear," Nathaniel said, noticing Lydia's gaze on the mantelpiece. "But she ceased to be the center of everything. It's time to live again." Lydia squeezed his hand gently. She did not reply. There was no need. The following days passed between simple tasks and moments of calm. Lydia did not abandon the kitchen. She continued kneading bread with her sleeves rolled up, reading stories to Clara by the fire, and picking flowers in the conservatory. But now the servants called her Madam, not out of obligation, but out of sincere respect. Nathaniel remained close, not stifling her with attention, but seeking her with his gaze in every corner. They shared knowing silences, brief gestures, intentional brushes as they passed in the hallway or sat together during breakfast. One afternoon, while Clara wrote in her notebook by the window, Lydia went out to the garden with a small spade. She knelt by the hedge and began to dig, planting new seeds, lavenders, lilies, pansies, flowers resilient to winter. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel asked, having arrived without her noticing. "Planting roots," she replied. "Where there were only memories, now I want to leave life." He knelt beside her, took a handful of earth and scattered it near the seeds. "Then let's sow them together." When the snow returned weeks later, it gently covered the new flowers but did not extinguish them. They slept beneath the cold, knowing spring would come. So too was their love, forged in pain, cultivated in tenderness, resistant to outside judgment. And when the rumors finally quieted, all that remained was the serene echo of two souls who found each other beyond prejudice, beyond mourning, beyond fear. 9 winters passed since that morning when the Penbrock mansion walls opened to love. Time had silvered Nathaniel's temples and softened Lydia's features, though in her eyes still burned the same serene flame of that first embrace in the conservatory. The house was no longer the same. Shadows had given way to new portraits, to toys in the hallways, to laughter escaping through open windows, even in the depths of winter. Clara, now 20 years old, had become an elegant and determined young woman. She retained the sweetness that had characterized her childhood, but her walk was firm, like one who knows she has survived pain and been loved with tenderness. She studied music and literature at a ladies' academy founded by Lydia on the very street where she was once humiliated. Yes, Lydia founded a school, not out of whim, but out of gratitude. She taught girls without illustrious surnames to read, write, and speak with dignity. The institution was supported by the Penbrocks and by donations from women who felt that her story, that of a maid who became the lady of a grand house, was also their own. And yes, they had children. The eldest, Thomas, was 8 years old and had his father's grey eyes, though more cheerful. The youngest, Eleanor Grace, at 6, had inherited Lydia's sweet smile and the poetic melancholy of her name. It was Nathaniel who insisted on naming her so, in memory of a past that no longer pained him, because forgiving was also a form of love. The mansion gardens flourished even in winter. Nathaniel had built a new, larger conservatory where Lydia planted cold, hardy flowers. They spent Sunday afternoons there, reading aloud while the children ran among the flower beds. Lilacs remained her favorite. And every year, on their wedding anniversary, Lydia found a fresh bouquet on her pillow, unnoted, unsigned, but with the exact perfume of that first winter together. As for Eleanor Fairchild, society does not easily forget. but it does rearrange its own. After the scandal, she was sent to live in Europe under the pretext of a nervous illness. She never returned. Her fall was silent, but definitive. She paid the price of her envy with solitude. No one ever mentioned her name aloud again, except Lydia, who remembered her not with resentment, but as the mirror that showed the abyss between appearance and heart. Mr. Avery retired at 72. He said goodbye without speeches, only with a handwritten letter, expressing gratitude for having witnessed the transformation of a sad house into a home full of life. In his place, Nathaniel hired a young butler who, in time, fell in love with one of the teachers at Lydia's school. High society, which had whispered with such venom, learned to keep silent. Some ladies secretly admired Lydia's courage. Others began to seek meaning beyond balls and titles. The Penbrock name, once associated with mourning and isolation, now evoked generosity, discretion, and true love. One snowy evening, Lydia found Nathaniel sitting by the main parlour window, his late wife's portrait long since removed. In its place hung an oil painting of Clara playing the piano, surrounded by the children. Nathaniel held an old book in his hands, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the white garden, pensive. "What are you thinking?" she asked, approaching in silence. He looked at her tenderly, took her hand, and replied, "That if I were born again, I would choose you from the very first day, and this time I wouldn't wait so long to tell you." Lydia smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and in that instant, everything seemed to stop. The ticking of the clock, the whisper of the snow, the passage of time, because when a love withstands shame, mourning, scandal, and prejudice, it no longer needs words, only roots and flowers that bloom even in winter. And so, on Fifth Avenue in New York, amidst marble columns, lace gloves, portraits, tears, and hidden gardens, the story was forever written of a woman who was dismissed with disdain and returned with dignity to conquer, without raising her voice, the heart of a man and the respect of an entire city. There are stories that mark us not by the noise they make, but by the echo they leave in the heart. Lydia and Nathaniel's is one of them. It reminds us that dignity is not inherited, it is conquered. That true love does not seek appearances or titles, but sincere glances, silent gestures, and the ability to resist together when everything seems against you. It teaches us that every wound can become a root, and that even in the cruelest winter hope blooms.